Good evening and welcome to all of you. My name is Marcia and I'll be your host during this program. This is what we know about your future. On this first day of the Forum on International Culture Festival. Under the theme We the People, the Forum explores whether a European people exists. And if so, what does it look like? We explore this theme in exhibitions, in theatre, in interviews and in debates. The imagination of European artists and thinkers takes center stage these days. I want to welcome everybody present here live at the Bali, and everyone watching the live stream, welcome to you too, wherever you are. And a special word of welcome to our guests, of course. We welcome tonight two prominent European thinkers, the Italian writer Francesca Melandri and the British journalist for the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman. They will share their ideas about the future of Europe tonight. You all know the corona crisis has caused one of the biggest health crises in European history. And it might cause an economic crisis as well. How will the political union come out of this? We will also look at possibilities to foster a sense of solidarity amongst the European people. And maybe there are some revolutionary forces that will change Europe for the better. These are the issues that we will discuss tonight. And this evening will be structured as follows. The team of Forum has sent a camera crew to our guests. So they filmed the participants in their own habitat, in Rome and in London. So first we will look at a video of Gideon Rachman, and he will join us live on Zoom for a follow-up conversation. Next then we will listen to Francesca Melandri. She too will be on Zoom afterwards. And their statements will be followed by a panel discussion between the two of them. After this, there's of course room for you, the audience. For all of you watching online, it is possible to ask a question to Gideon or Francesca. Please use Slido, that is sly.do. It comes with a code. You see that at the bottom of your screen, and you can answer your question using that code. Now, let me introduce to you our speakers. Francesca Melandri is an Italian author. She's a screenwriter and documentary filmmaker. Her novels, such as the award-winning debut Eva Sleeps, and Sangue Giusto, which is translated into Dutch as De Lange Weg naar Rome, Long Way to Rome, they deal with themes such as regional identity and Italy's national identity, and with Italy's amnesia with respect to its fascist and colonial past. In March, Melandri, she addressed the British people in a beautiful, compassionate letter in The Guardian. As an Italian, she wanted to warn the British people for the virus, and she described its impact on her and her country. Its title, the title of that piece, became the title of tonight's program. This is what we know about your future. Gideon Rachman then, he's a British journalist, author and commentator. He's the chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times. His main interests are American foreign policy, the European Union, and globalization. He wrote several books. One of it is Zero-Sum World, another Easternization, War and Peace in the Asian Century, about the end of Western domination. Let's start now with the first keynote by Gideon Rachman.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about the future of Europe. The fact that I'm having to do this from London is rather sad. It would have been great to have been able to join you in Amsterdam. But of course, it tells you something about some of the challenges that we're facing and the way in which COVID-19 has made us rethink things that we took for granted, the ability to just, hop on a plane, travel, go all over Europe, indeed, go all over the world. And it is one of the challenges to the future of Europe that I'd like to talk about now. But I think if you want to understand the context of what we're going through, it's perhaps helpful to look at some history, because I think that Europe at the moment is facing a number of very severe challenges. I'll just outline them very briefly before going back in time. Challenge number one is COVID-19. But then before that, you had the financial crisis, the Greek debt crisis, and the scars that's left on the Eurozone. Then you had the shocking year of 2016, which had two big events in it, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, who's the first US president who is, I think you could say, actively hostile to the idea of the European Union. And then a broader geopolitical context, which is the rise of China, an increasingly assertive China, and also a more hostile Russia. So the whole world is looking more alarming, if you like, from a European perspective. Now, it's tempting to say, well, maybe things were always this way. Europe's always faced very difficult challenges. But I do think this is an unusually difficult period, although, as I'll explain towards the end, I think in some ways a hopeful period. But it's an unusually difficult period compared, say, to the first 20 years when I first started thinking and covering the European Union. I started my journalistic career in the late 1980s. And I guess the defining event for everyone of my generation was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that ushered in, I think, a very hopeful and optimistic period in Europe, which lasted roughly 20 years. You could say from 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to 2008, the financial crisis. And if you look at the signature events of what was happening in Europe back then, they were generally periods of progress and hope. So you have the launch of the completion of the internal market in 1992. You have the enlargement of the European Union, bringing in all the countries of the former Soviet bloc, or almost all of them, which was both a massive expansion of the EU politically, but also a signal of confidence that this was an organization that represented the future, an organization that people aspire to join. And then you have, in the early 2000s, the launch of the euro, probably the most ambitious project the European Union had envisaged since it was created in the 1950s. So things were going pretty well. But then I think you have a run of bad luck, if you like, or maybe it's built into the project. We can discuss that in a bit. But from 2008, and it's worth looking at how these different challenges have impacted on the EU. Now, obviously, to a Dutch audience, doesn't need to be reminded of the controversies around the bailouts for Greece and the strains that the financial crisis has introduced into the EU, including particularly lack of trust and often really ill feeling between countries that were in real financial trouble, Greece, Italy, Spain, and the countries that felt that they were being asked to bail out other countries in Southern Europe, the Northern Europeans. That's been smoothed over to some extent, but I think it's left lasting a legacy of distrust, which is kind of still working its way through the project. Then Brexit and Trump. Obviously, Brexit was a big blow to many of us in Britain as well, but I think it was the first time that this idea that the European Union represented the future, that this was an organization that self-evidently countries wanted to join, had been rejected by a large country. I mean, the Norwegians had refused to join and so on. But this was the first big country that had voluntarily left. And we can all think back to the immediate aftermath, where I think a lot of people in Brussels and some people in London, people in Brussels feared and some in London hoped that this could be the beginning of a process of unraveling of the European Union. And although I think that's stabilized since then, it's still a blow to the prestige, if you like, and self-confidence of the EU, which is being worked through, combined with the election of Trump, which was within months of Brexit, and which were, I think, linked events because they were this sense of populist revolt against an elite project. And the fact that Trump himself is so hostile to the EU, both in terms of the way he talks about it. He said that the EU was created to take advantage of the United States, which is a remarkably radical way for an American president to describe the EU, and a big departure from the supportive attitude that American presidents have taken to European integration from Eisenhower through Kennedy, through Obama, even George W. Bush. Generally, they've regarded the EU as a partner and as a good thing. So now you have the sense that this is an American president who's hostile to it, that is actually cheering on some of the forces within the European Union, the populist, skeptical forces that want to take the EU apart. People like Salvini or Nigel Farage in Britain, who incidentally was the first European through the door to see Trump after Trump's election, and I think that tells you something. So that's a shock to the system and a big challenge. Then, of course, China and Russia. China really wasn't, I think, something that people thought about much as affecting the future of the European Union. Certainly when I was working in Brussels up until about 2005, I remember Javier Solana, who was the EU's foreign policy guy at the time, saying to me that in the many years that he covered foreign policy for the EU, he hadn't even visited China. It wasn't felt to be, it was an interesting story, but it wasn't felt to be a challenge to the EU. And I think that's changing. You have China now that is by some measures the largest economy in the world, that is becoming more, not less authoritarian, and that is increasingly assertive about the way it wants to be treated in the world, and is adopting much more aggressive, what they call wolf warrior diplomacy, where if the Chinese feel they're being checked or thwarted in some way, they let you know about it. And so you have, for example, the Swedes, the Norwegians being put under enormous pressure by China for not talking about China in the way that they want. So you have even, if you like, a threat to free speech within Europe, an implied threat that if you don't talk about the world the way that Beijing wants you to, you could lose access to their markets or lucrative foreign investment. And then, of course, there's Russia. Ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the tragedies with the shooting down of the Malaysian airline, many Dutch lives lost, of course, I don't need to remind you of that. We've necessarily taken a much more negative view of what relations with Moscow is going to be like. So put all that together, it looks pretty bleak. And then you have COVID-19, which once again opens strains within Europe, a sense that solidarity has failed in the hour of need, particularly right at the beginning, where the Southern Europeans are saying, once again, we discover that Northern Europe actually isn't interested in helping us, and so on. That was a very difficult moment. So why, despite all that, do I think that maybe one could put a hopeful gloss on this? Well, I think it's because that in this more hostile environment, with all the challenges that I've described, the Europeans have thought about it and realized that they need each other, that in a world with rising hostile powers like China, with a hostile United States, with Britain playing a very ambiguous and potentially a harmful role on the outside, individual European countries could be at the mercy of very large, not friendly countries such as China or Trump-run United States. If you're Slovakia, if you're Spain even, or Germany, on your own, you're not in great shape to push back if you're under enormous pressure from Washington or Beijing or even Moscow. But if you're the European Union, you can point to the world's largest internal market. And why does that matter? Partly because although we think of superpower struggle in terms of, often in terms of military force, actually in the modern world, thank goodness so far, that's not how these struggles are playing out. They're playing out as economic rivalries. So if the US wants to put pressure on you, they'll impose economic sanctions, they'll use the force of the dollar. You've seen Trump, for example, threatening auto tariffs on Germany. The same with China. They will threaten to withdraw investment. They will cancel your projects in their country. But as a large market, the European Union has the power to hit back. I think one reason why the Americans have stayed their hands on tariffs on the EU is the fear that you would get tariffs on the whole of the European market in response. So the Europeans can see a very direct reason to hang together. And I think that helps to smooth over another of the difficult internal challenges I should have mentioned, which is the question of the survivability of liberal values and democracy in a couple of European countries, and particularly Hungary and Poland. That is a problem, and it's something the European Union should take seriously. But I think we're maybe getting to the realization that as well as being a union of values, the European Union is also increasingly becoming an alliance of shared interests. I don't think the Hungarians and Poles are going to leave because they get money from Brussels, but also because in the end, for all their talk of Viktor Orban, of a liberal democracy and so on, actually Hungary gets a lot of protection from being inside the EU. And equally, although I think the EU is rightly going to put pressure on Poland and Hungary, I don't think its fundamental character as a alliance of liberal democratic states, which is increasingly important in this world I've been describing, is in question as long as the major countries in Western Europe remain liberal democracies. And I think, touch wood, that is likely to remain the case. But I think that those countries, the Frances, the Germanys, the Netherlands, although they will want to make their voices heard in Budapest and Warsaw on fundamental values, it's not in their interests. I was going to say our interests, but Britain's no longer part of the club. It's not in their interests to kick Poland and Hungary out, because it's better to have them in the club where you can exert some pressure and where they're part of this big internal market, which is why I think, as well as being a union of values, the EU is a kind of alliance. It's a group of countries sharing a geographic space, sharing interests, even when their political outlooks are quite different. And for that reason, they'll stick together. And let me finish by talking about an issue that I know is controversial in the Netherlands, but also that I think does point to a kind of the potential of the European Union to develop its power internationally. And that is this agreement brought about by COVID-19, by the reaction to COVID-19, for the EU to borrow on international markets. Now, I know that the Dutch and the British, had we been in, would be and are extremely wary of the idea of any pooling of debt within the EU. And I think, frankly, you're correct to be wary of it. It's not feasible for Northern Europeans to pay off the debts of Italy. But I think that probably can be avoided while advancing this idea of issuing new debt through the European Union in common. Old debt and new debt can be kept separate. And new debt has some advantages, because one of the biggest power sources of the United States we're discovering in this world in which people aren't actually using their military force is the dollar. That is why America can push countries around by threatening to exclude them from American financial markets and so on. That's a huge force. The dollar has no international rival. The Chinese currency is not tradable on international markets. The euro could be that rival if people borrowed around the world, if they used euro debt as a new safe asset. And for the European Union, as well as creating a power of attraction through issuing European debt against the security of the European economy, the European Union economy, it would also potentially open the way to a huge source of cheap funding, because at the moment, interest rates are very low and they may stay low for a very long time. If the European Union could start issuing debt at low interest rates, it potentially creates a big new source of revenue to fund things like infrastructure, or maybe even, if the politics can be get right, some form of common defense. So I think that it was a bit of a cliche of my time in Brussels, one I got a bit bored of, which was that the European Union does best in times of crisis. But I think that this particular crisis, COVID-19, by leading to a breakthrough in thinking about the way the EU will act as an economic unit, as an entity that can borrow on international markets, has, as well as creating challenges, also created quite exciting new possibilities for the European Union, which is one of the reasons I'm still fairly optimistic about the European project.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rachman. Let's see if we can have you on the screen. Yes, there you are. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for this small, compact lecture. We have a few questions. Mr. Rachman, you said when the pandemic hit Europe, solidarity failed in the hour of need. Were you personally surprised when you saw that happen?
No, and I think in retrospect it was slightly overstated, because it was a moment in time when it looked like this was going to be something that only damaged Southern Europe, and we were all panicking a bit, and borders began to close and so on. And there was maybe a replay of all the kind of traumas of the Euro crisis, where Southern Europeans were primed to think that the Northern Europeans are going to be ungenerous and are going to blame us for our own situation. And the Northern Europeans were primed to think, the Southern Europeans are going to use any excuse to try to revive this old argument. But one of the, there's not much that's encouraging about COVID-19, but one of the relatively encouraging things was the way in which Europeans got past that, managed to take a deep breath to realize that not everything, for example, the return of border controls, need be seen as a kind of disastrous threat to the EU. They might just be a pragmatic effort to control the spread of a disease. And then the thing I ended my talk on, this real change of heart in Berlin, which then allowed the EU to make this advance on common debt, which I think has really satisfied the Southern European requirement for some kind of gesture of solidarity, while being able to avoid alarming people too much in Germany and elsewhere about, sorry, that's domestic phone, about, the idea that their pockets are going to be picked by the Southern Europeans. So I think.
And did we get past that? Did we get past that division, North and South, well enough with the Recovery Solidarity Fund?
Yeah, it seems to be the way. Yeah. I don't know what your feeling about the current European debate is, but that early phase where you thought, oh my God, once again in a crisis, everyone in Europe's at each other's throats. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And if anything, the kind of recriminations now seem to be more domestic, so that, from what I can see in debates in my own country, but also in Spain, people are looking at their national performances, Sweden too, but not so much saying, well, this is because we're not being helped by other Europeans.
Yeah. You also mentioned Brexit as one of the EU's severe challenges. What is remarkable, I think, is that we haven't seen a reflection ever since in Brussels on this major accident. So we just act as if nothing has happened. We'll just proceed with the rest of the club. Do you think it is wise not to put too much emphasis on this, I think, trauma?
It's a tricky one. I mean, I remember talking to a European businessman who said, he put that question in a sort of business style way where he said, look, if I'm a major business and I lose one of my biggest customers, I look at myself and I go to the customer and I say, look, what did I do wrong? How can I adjust things so that we continue in our relationship? Why isn't Europe behaving like this? Which I hadn't really thought of it like that. And my response was actually, it's because Europe is not like a business. It's closer to a religion. And if somebody sort of walks out of the Jehovah's Witnesses don't say, well, there's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with you. And that's a slightly facetious way of looking at it. But I do think that there is this sort of sense in Europe that Britain had asked such fundamental questions that if they weren't prepared to accept the basic tenets of the European project, well, it was our loss. Now, that sense that it's the Brits that have got something wrong rather than the Europeans, I think has been hardened by the kind of fairly chaotic UK response. It's become clear, I think many Europeans maybe have an overestimate of this sort of Machiavellian, sort of forward-thinking British and assumed we had this great
but you're not.
We were going to roll out, but obviously we don't. And the whole thing is kind of a mess. And now we, thrashing around a bit. These things change over time. Maybe in 5 years' time, Brexit will look better, but it's not looking very good at the moment. So that those early visions and fear, I think, in Brussels that, wow, maybe a load of countries will leave. It's not looking like an attractive option. So I think the Europeans can be a bit more relaxed about it. It's possible that they may be a little bit too relaxed, because I think if we head for no deal, that will be a blow to the European economy, particularly to countries like the Netherlands, which do a lot of trade with Britain.
Definitely, yeah.
You'll find there tariffs on food, tariffs on cars, etc. I still think that will probably avoid that. And then the question is, okay, if we can settle down to a less than disastrous economic relationship where trade basically persists, it's eroded a bit.
Okay.
And most of the losses on the British side. Then I think once things settle down, then maybe it's time for an assessment on both sides and a way of trying to incorporate the UK into a new kind of European architecture as a sort of diplomatic power, as a military power, and as a partner on values, because I think that is going to be increasingly important, because We don't know what the US is going to look like after November. But as I said in the speech, Russia, China, we need to group together if we can. Now, I think that's more important for London to realize, frankly, than for Brussels, Berlin, Amsterdam. But both sides need to work on that because we have shared
But it will be a totally new relationship, that's for sure. Mr. Rachman, we have to leave it at this for now. We'll be back with you later. Thank you very much. Because it's time we move to our second keynote, the keynote by Francesca Melandri.
About the island of Ventotene. It's a beautiful, very tiny speck of land not far off the coast of Italy, halfway between Rome and Naples, and it's surrounded by beautiful, transparent waters. The fascist regime exiled here many of its opposers, and they were forced to stay here sometimes for years on end in very dire conditions. Something extraordinary happened in Ventotene in August 1941. Altiero Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, Ursula Hirschman, and Eugenio Colorni, who were confined there, wrote the Ventotene Manifesto, and the subtitle is Per un'Europa libera e unita, for a free and united Europe, a draft manifesto, in which they claim that they stand for, and I quote, the definitive abolition of the division of Europe in sovereign national states. Let me repeat it. The definitive abolition of the division of Europe in sovereign national states. They were definitely not mincing words. To give you some context, what was happening in the world around them as they were imagining a future European Union? Well, the Wehrmacht had just reached the outskirts of Kiev in the town of Kamianets-Politsky, and there it massacred 23,000 Jews. This was 1 month before Babi Yar, and these two massacres were basically major stepping stones to get the Holocaust machine in full gear. So the Manifesto of Ventotene also says, and again I quote, a free and united Europe is the necessary premise for the strengthening of modern civilization, of which the totalitarian era represents an arrest. The end of this era will be to immediately resume in full the historical process against inequality and social privileges, end quote. So you see how the idea of Europe that these founding fathers and mothers envisioned was inextricably linked to the idea of social justice. There cannot be a socially just society which doesn't transcend nationalism, says the Ventotene Manifesto, and just like there can't be a united federal Europe which hasn't as a core the values of social justice. The enormity of the leap of faith in the human possibilities that those visionaries expressed during Europe's darkest hour, and the fact that they were right, because here we are in a thing which is called the European Forum on Culture, probably moves you and inspires you as much as it does to me. However, if we limit ourselves to the admiration for those great minds and claim we're their followers and successors in the actualization of the European vision and values, we are running a great risk. And I call it the Jefferson effect. Come with me. It's a simple image. Thomas Jefferson is penning the immortal declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And he's at his desk. Outside of the window, there are fields in his beautiful property of Monticello in Virginia. And on those fields, there are people who are working them. And these people are dark-skinned, and they are unpaid, and they can be bought or sold. They have no freedom, and they can be raped, tortured, and killed at their master's whim. And the fact that Jefferson doesn't do it doesn't mean that he couldn't if he wanted, and some masters actually do. So, in other words, these men and women are denied every moment of their lives exactly that self-evident truth. The blank spaces between the words of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America is filled with the silence surrounding those slaves. Almost 250 years later, the brutality and structural violence implicit in that silence is unfolding in front of our eyes, even now in 2020, in the political and social tragedy which is going on in the States. And this, for us Europeans, must really be seen as a cautionary tale. We must beware of the building our ideas and aspirations of what Europe is, not just on the stated values, which we say in the mutual relationships and so forth, but also on this ominous structural violence. And what is the silence I'm talking about? Well, before I answer, please come back with me to Ventotene. Among Ventotene's many wonders is the fact that it's the first stop for migrating birds coming from the coast of northern Africa. They arrive exhausted after having been flying for the whole of the night, and they arrive immediately and they feast on the seeds, the fruits, and the nectars of the Mediterranean bush. Now, you probably know where I'm getting at. The truth is that the European wealth, the fact that our cities are the most livable probably in the planet, that we have better standards of living than probably anywhere else, is not because we are better, as white supremacists would have, but because the last half millennium of world history has been built on a simple structural model. The rest of the world provided, and to a great extent still provides, goods, food, wealth, spices, fuel, and free or cheap labor to the whiter-skinned inhabitants of the planet. It's what we call colonialism. The people coming from the places which we plundered and with whose riches we made our cities beautiful and civilized, they're on the move. They do not stop like the birds in Ventotene, but they do stop in Lampedusa, in Lesbos, and in the Balkan forests. Now you see what I mean by the Jefferson effect. Every time that we feel proud about the freedom of movement which Schengen gave us, we're silencing the fact that the opening of our internal borders has coincided almost to the day with the creation, solidification, and brutalization of the walls of Fortress Europe. We like to make fun of Donald Trump, who promised an impossible wall with Mexico, and feel rightfully horrified at the treatment of people, including children, at the hands of his immigration officials. But we are not saying anything, and we seem to be stultified by the enormity of the humanitarian crisis at our own borders. And all the while we, the proud heirs of European civilization and the Enlightenment, allow camps where the rule of law and habeas corpus is so completely suspended, both within the fortress walls, like in Lesbos, or outside, for instance, in Libya. Future generations will look upon this just as we look on the fact that Jefferson, the moment he wrote the Declaration, didn't rush off in the fields and free his slaves. We are not rushing off to save those people from their rapists and torturers in the camps in Libya. We are letting them rot there. And to those who do make it to our beautiful, vibrant cities, we are more and more denying legal acknowledgement. We deny them citizenship, documents, legal status. Historian Timothy Snyder clarified beyond any doubt in his book Bloodlands that the reason the Holocaust was possible was to deprive the Jews of any citizenship, that is, of the protection of the state. He makes it very clear. The Jews who lived in states who still recognized them as citizens, even paradoxically the German Nazi state, had one chance in two of surviving the war. The Jews who lived in states where this was not happening any longer because the states had been crushed and destroyed by the German invasion had 1 in 20. That is, 19 died and 1 survived. What does this mean? That citizenship is the most basic protection to human beings. It's the second most fundamental human right after that of life. Depriving people of the right to be citizens is the road which leads to abuse, violence, mass killings, and slavery. It is, to all effects, a crime against humanity. And yet this is exactly what we, Europeans, are doing so carelessly. We not only kick back more and more asylum seekers, denying their right to be helped, as all the international conventions we ever signed would force us to do, but in some countries like Italy, we also deny the citizenship to people who are born there, like in Italy. The children who are born there do not have a right to citizenship. We're letting them remain stateless, unrecognized, with no right to vote, nor to be part of the society they are actually part of. We only let them pay taxes. We willingly leave them vulnerable to abuse or potential abuse of any kind. We even strip them sometimes of their citizenship, something we would never do to someone with a white skin and blonde hair. So what's the role of us, the writers, the thinkers? Well, what we're faced with this time and age is nothing less than a cognitive apocalypse. The enormity of the inequality in this world is hitting us all in the head. The clear and present danger of our annihilation as a species is staring us right in our eyes. COVID-19 has brought home with a vengeance how our relationship with the biosphere is making us literally sick. But of course, those who are being hit and surprised by this news, with these revelations of inequality and injustice and the effects of global warming, are not those who actually suffer them. It's the so-called epistemological burden of the victim. The oppressor can and will forget the harm he is inflicting on others, but the victim can't because it's their life. For instance, if the hashtag #MeToo movement surprised you with the ubiquity of sexual harassment in the workplace, you most certainly are not a woman. If in the last months, since the Black Lives Matter movement has become global, you have been shocked at how much structural racism we have even in our democratic societies, your skin is probably white. No Afro-European was shocked in any way. That's what they live every day of their lives. COVID-19 has been a mirror. It has forced us to look at ourselves. And what we saw wasn't always pretty. We are seeing how the brunt of the pandemic is hitting so much more the underprivileged, the oppressed, the colonized, the minimum wage workers, the beaten wives. Europe, I must say, hasn't been the worst, and from this I take hope, and I hope you share my hope this brings. The last month that if you are unlucky enough to have to live through a pandemic, Europe is not the worst place to be. The beginning wasn't good, especially for us Italians, as far as solidarity and as far as everything that went on, but then things did get better, and they are getting better. The talks around the Recovery Fund are showing us that whatever politicians say to their constituencies when they're back home, actually nobody really wants the breakup of the European Union except the fascists and the nationalists. So this is good, or at least it could turn out to be good. We'll see if we live up to this promise. Also, it's very clear that the real division is not between the Nordic and the southern countries, as nationalists would have us believe, but between the people within each country that want a European Union which is based more on solidarity and social justice, and those who actually want to break it apart. However, the discrepancy between so much of what we used to think we knew about the world and what is appearing blatantly in front of our eyes is not for the faint of heart. That's why I call what we're facing, and I really don't think I'm exaggerating, a cognitive apocalypse. We simply cannot keep on looking at the world the same way we used to, or we as a species are doomed. It's as simple as that. But mind you, in ancient Greek, apocalypse doesn't mean catastrophe. It actually means revelation. So our task as people who work in cognition is to reveal the implicit foundations of what we're explicitly doing. Our task is to make sure that we do not allow the future Europe to be built on silences, which will then lead, certainly, to structural violence and injustice. We have to speak out loud the unspoken, and then question it, and then completely shift our perspectives. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Take freedom of movement. So, we claim Europe is about universal human rights, and freedom of movement is one of them. Wonderful, I can go with that. But then why are we allowing a travel apartheid, de facto? Why can I go to Ethiopia anytime I want, which I did recently twice on a very comfortable Ethiopian Airlines flight, and a woman who's my age and my talent and my education and equivalent to me from Addis Ababa cannot come to Rome except by paying 10 times as much as I paid my airplane ticket, a passeur who will probably hand her on to human traffickers and have her beaten and raped and closed in a camp for who knows how long. Why is this? What's the difference between us? How does my enlightened, self-evident truth about the equality of humankind justify this? Well, it can't. It doesn't. Exactly like the Declaration of Independence could in no way justify the fact that Jefferson had slaves. Because the problem of the people drowning in the Mediterranean is in the very first place, why are they there in the middle of the sea instead of on a plane? So let me tell you what the late David Graeber said. He was a visionary of the caliber of the people in Ventotene who wrote the manifesto, and I'm sure many of you share the sadness at his untimely and much too young death recently. He told us, imagine what would happen if instead of worrying about the invasion, you know, this old argument, which we, the richest country on earth, would have to sustain if we open freedom of movement to everyone on the planet, imagine if we turned the issue around. And imagine the kind of world which would be produced if, as a first step, we allowed the human right to actually manifest, which is freedom of movement for all human beings on the planet. Imagine what kind of world this would be created. Wouldn't we, richer countries, have a very, very strong incentive to make the countries those people live in more livable, more democratic, less affected by global warming, and so forth? Because everybody, at the end of the day, what they really want to do is to live in their home. Is this far-fetched? Is this too visionary? Should we be more accepting of reality as it is? Now tell that to the men and women who wrote the manifesto of Ventotene while the massacre of Kamenets-Podilsky was undergoing. We need to be visionary. We need to turn reality on its head. We have no other choice. But our duty as workers of the cognitive level of life is also to take care of all the people who are very understandably overwhelmed by this epochal shift of perspectives, this cognitive apocalypse. I have no intention of expanding my sympathies to those who want to manipulate them and them turn into fascists, but I do feel that our duty as people who have a voice is not to speak only to the people who think like us. That would be too easy and lazy. James Baldwin once said, quote, "I imagine that people cling to their hate so stubbornly because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." End quote. Our duty as writers, thinkers, and people of culture is to take care of that pain, precisely that, to give it voice, to not allow it to be a fertilizer of that silence which leads to fascism, hatred, and violence. Our professional tool as storytellers is imaginative empathy. Well, dear colleagues, this is the time to use it. Why should I feel guilty because 2 generations ago my Dutch forebears massacred tens of thousands of Indonesians? A person from, say, Amersfoort can say. Or why should I feel guilty for fascists invading Ethiopia 50 years before I was born? A person from Turin could say, well, I am unemployed, I don't even know how to pay the rent next month. These are legitimate questions, and which we must not shrug off. Our task is to help them find the answer. And the answer is not to feel guilty for the past. Guilt has no use in envisioning new worlds, but to feel responsible for the society we live in the present, which was built on that past. James Baldwin also said, quote, "I can't be a pessimist because I am alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter, so I am forced to be an optimist." End quote. Ernesto Rossi, Altiero Spinelli, Ursula Hirschman, and Eugenio Colorni didn't see human life in academic terms. They were optimistic and visionary, not in spite of the fact that Europe was undergoing its darkest hour, but because of it. We need to be like them. I will close with the last words of the Manifesto of Ventotene, and I quote, "The way forward is neither easy nor safe, but it must be traveled, and it will be." End quote. Thank you.
Hello, Mrs. Melandri.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much. That was a very rich talk in 15 minutes. It's incredible how many ideas you put into that. And thank you so much for the Ventotene story, because I didn't know it, and it's a beautiful story. Thank you for that. To go back a little bit, you wrote that beautiful letter in The Guardian. It was a moving, compassionate letter to the people of the UK. And you ended with the words, "When all of this is over, the world won't be the same." I know it all isn't fully over yet, but what can you say has already changed?
Well, Mr. Rachman already said something about this. Europe is changing. And I also mentioned it in my talk at the beginning of the pandemic. Europe didn't show its nicest side. And, you know, in Italy, we really felt it because we were like in the middle of the tragedy and this
of the crisis,
this distance from the other Europeans was very painful at times even. But again, as both of our talks, we mentioned this, it did get better. And Europe is getting better, and we will see how it goes. But there is a sense that there is really no alternative to being together. And this is something which is changing things. The very biggest geopolitical news of the year will certainly be November's elections in the States. Well, I guess we're all very anxious about this. That will really be, I see that really as a fork. It's an either or very much situation. So, of course.
And it's hard speculating what that will bring.
It's very hard to speculate. It's a very, very close call. So, but at the end, that will really determine a lot.
Yeah, central in your talk is this idea of a cognitive apocalypse. I must say, also that was new to me. You said a bit about that, but could you be brief about what exactly you meant by it to make the idea a bit more clear?
Well, this idea that in simpler terms, you can say the realization that more and more people, I would say, I don't know if the majority, but certainly nearing the majority of people are having that things as were before simply cannot go on. And this is a really big shift, because what are things? What do we mean by things? We mean our lifestyle, and also we mean what we think of ourselves, what we think of our place in the world. In my talk, I mentioned colonialism and the colonial legacy, and the fact that Europe has been made by the wealth siphoned from the rest of the world. And again, this used to be a very, minority view in post-colonial study departments. Now it's really becoming, again, I wouldn't say mainstream, but certainly more and more. It's like a realization, we are not alone, and we have never been alone. Yeah. We have never been alone, which also means we cannot be alone in the future. And we have a responsibility towards ourselves, each other as Europeans, but also to the rest of the world. We are part of the world. Yeah. And something like a pandemic really brings home the fact that we are linked. We're all linked. Yeah. This in a planetary way.
Yeah. You say this idea is gaining support. But we see at the same time strong polarization in European societies. Because you say rightly, how is it possible that we let people drown in the Mediterranean? How is it possible that we let them rot at our frontiers? And at the same time, in many European countries, because it's also happening in Italy, the support for the populist parties is growing as well. And their major topic is this: keep foreigners out, they say. And they eagerly point, I'm sorry to say, but also to people like you and many others as examples of an elite that has lost a connection with the ordinary people. How do you, as a very engaged writer, how do you relate to that?
Well, I relate simply describing and showing the fact that our cities are diverse. We are no longer all white-skinned in Europe, and new Europeans are our neighbors, are our spouses, are our children. Their children are going to school with our children. So it's not something that we should avoid or that we should want. Neither approach is realistic. It's happening, and it's here. It's among us. It's the reality we're in.
Yeah, well, that's a whole discussion. We're not getting into that now. Let's invite Mr. Rachman to come back, because we're very eager to have you both enter into a discussion. Mr. Rachman, there you are. Welcome back. Mr. Rachman, in March, you too wrote in the Financial Times, you said, the nation state is now making a comeback fueled by this extraordinary crisis. What does that mean for the future of the EU, that the nation state is making a comeback?
Well, I mean, can I will deal with that, but actually, if you don't mind, I would like to pick up on some of the points Francesca made about open borders and so on, because I think they're incredibly important. And I disagree quite profoundly, but I feel very bad saying that, because I thought the vision that she presented for the world was an extremely attractive one in some ways. But my fear about it is the obvious one, the one you alluded to: what would be the political response? And I think it's a kind of clash of values, because, we're all Democrats. We believe in elections and so on. And maybe I'm too cynical about my fellow citizens, but I just don't believe that you could have a party could win power in my country, or really any European country I know, on a manifesto of open borders. And I don't think, however persuasive intellectuals are and moral philosophers are, that they would be able to persuade their fellow citizens on that. So if you did that, you might actually end up making things worse, because I think you would have the rise of far-right parties and so on. Maybe that is too pessimistic, but I would note that even Barack Obama deported a lot of people from the United States.
Oh, yes.
It's not often noted, but he was not a believer in open borders. And I don't think that's because he's a bad guy. I think it's just because he's a pragmatic politician. He looked at how what was feasible, what was politically feasible in America, and that led him down some quite dark paths. But as I say, I don't think it's because he's immoral. I think it's because you make tough choices, and I think that maybe he got the balance wrong. But I think broadly speaking, the idea of completely open borders would be politically unsustainable in Europe.
Mrs.
But
Melandri?
on the other, and I'd be interested.
Well,
maybe
let's switch to Francesca to have a react to you.
Well, I quoted David Graeber as a visionary, as far-seeing as the Ventotene people were from the place they were in. I, of course, not proposing that tomorrow in the EU this open border law should be passed. The issue I'm bringing is mobility. Why must the people from the rest of the world only be able to reach Europe in dinghies? Why can't there be policy of immigration and ruled bilateral, transparent possibility of crossing borders? Why can't it be mutual? And by the way, this would also allow Europe to have a lot more control into who's coming, because we have basically given up, with some exceptions, the possibility to have legal immigration, and with the strengthening of these borders. So the brunt of immigration is now made in catastrophic terms. And not only from a humanitarian point of view, but also from the chaotic terms. Now, if you take away the values, but it's chaotic. It's not managed. And a legal way of entry into Europe would be much more manageable.
See, I'm not sure now what you're arguing for, because, I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, I don't think that we are zero immigration places. I mean, if I think in my lifetime, the population of Britain has gone up from 55 million.
Well, we are in Italy. We are in Italy, for instance. In Italian law, it's virtually almost impossible to immigrate legally with the Bossi-Fini law. Now,
Right.
Of course, different countries have different laws, so this
Yeah,
also should be equalized.
Okay.
It also should be equalized in
I'm sorry,
European...
I'm intervening now, because otherwise
Yeah,
we will spend all our spare time with talking about immigration,
Sure,
which is
of
a
course.
tremendously important topic, but we've got so much more we want to discuss with you. To come back to the nation states, Mr. Rachman, you said it is fueled by this crisis. Is that a problem for the EU?
Well, actually, I think, that was a column that it's one of the bad things about being a columnist. You describe the world as it seems each week. And that was the early stages of the crisis, when borders were closing and even personal protective equipment was being hoarded within countries and so on. I think that now, although the nation state has made a comeback in the sense that each country has to come up with its own national action plan. And frankly, we've all stopped traveling, witness this evening. That sense that European solidarity was going to collapse, I think we're over it now. But, more broadly, though, I do think that globalization, which was a kind of erosion of the nation state, which has been something that's been going on for 30 years, and you could see even the European Union as a sort of mini experiment in globalization within European borders, i.e., get it, as Francesca said, you scrap borders within the EU, you create a single market and so on. But there was also a global process going on involving, huge growth in trade. That is beginning to reverse, and was already reversing before the pandemic, partly for reasons of protectionism, so that the United States is putting up tariffs, trying to repatriate industries. They're now putting big controls on exports of technology to China and so on. And I think that process of economic integration that we've taken for granted for 40 years, and also some freedom of movement or rises in immigration, is under much more strain because we're in a more nationalistic phase.
Yeah, but in your writing in the Financial Times, you oppose this globalization, getting on the reverse, to autarky, countries really trying to be self-sufficient. But isn't that a bit unrealistic? Would it be much more realistic to have like the European Union as like the center for all these countries to get everything from, so not to be dependent?
I think it's definitely unrealistic for a small country. Slovakia, even the Netherlands, which is a big trading nation, it's not going to happen. But I think if you're the United States or China, certainly the United States is flirting with the idea, even the UK, which started this whole Brexit thing, saying, we have to be global Britain and do more trade, is now talking about more tariff barriers and possibly trying to create national champions again. I think for most countries in the world, autarky is really not an option. But the US is the central economy, really. It's the largest economy in the world. And they are, I think, looking quite serious, not at total autarky, but at repatriation of industries, repatriation of strategic industries, and just generally becoming more protectionist. And I think in response, China might do the same, because it too has the scale to do that if it wants to.
Yeah. Mrs. Melandri, in your talk, you were hopeful about the Recovery Fund, the Solidarity Fund. Do you see that as a sign of evidence of a European people?
Well, today I was listening to Mr. Timmermans' presentation of the European New Green Deal. It's a very ambitious project and proposal and project, which aims at cutting emissions in Europe by 55%, I think, by 2030. That is in 10 years. It's a big acceleration of the greening of Europe. Of course, we will have to see how this goes, if it's actually implemented, if it works. Today it was announced, but as announcements go, it was, I think, not only extremely positive and going in the absolutely right direction, but it also shows that this is exactly the kind of thing that no single nation state in Europe could do on their own.
And do you feel that the European Commission is able to do so because they are not dependent on democratic elections, so that they can act more sovereign on such a huge project?
Well, the last European elections saw a huge surge into the green parties of Europe in most countries. I'm very sad to say not in Italy. Italy was a sad exception. But apart from Italy, in most countries, the Greens, whichever way they presented themselves, had a very big success. And now they are one of the biggest groups in the European Parliament. So that is the people. That is the electorate.
So do you agree, Mr. Rachman?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was one of the misunderstandings of the British debate, actually, was this idea that the Commission is this entirely undemocratic thing that's just floating out there. I mean, it is a slightly peculiar organisation because it has the sole right of initiative and so on. I think that is a bit odd, but it's appointed by democratic governments. And if it were to go wholly against the will of the European people, that wouldn't last very long, because it would be put in check by the European Council, by the European Parliament.
No, of course they are dependent on democratic governments, but don't they have a bit more of independence and space to put in place such an ambitious program as the Green Deal, not being dependent on elections and having to look at populist parties not wanting to go that way?
Yeah, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that, there are various forms of democracy. You can have the very direct form, a referendum, which is what we had in the UK. And, that's not necessarily always a great idea. It can be. But equally, I think you can have institutions like courts or like the European Commission, which in the end are part of a democratic structure, but which do have some kind of independence, don't necessarily have the electorate breathing down their neck every day. And I don't think you necessarily need to apologize for that. There's never been a perfect way of structuring things, but giving technocrats some kind of distance, I think, to me, is healthy, but maybe I'm an elitist.
Yeah. In this discussion about solidarity, the northern countries not wanting to be solidar with the southern ones, this is a discussion that has been going on, of course, for a while. And the northern countries have time and again been rejecting a transfer union. You've been writing a lot about that, Mr. Rachman. This not wanting the transfer union, is that a lack of solidarity, Mr. Rachman?
No, I've got some sympathy with it. I mean, first of all, there is a degree of transfers within the European Union. You have the structural funds, the cohesion funds, etc.
Yeah, but I mean taking over each other's debts, of course.
Yeah, I think that is only possible if you have a single European polity, because I think that if I was the Dutch or the Germans, I would be concerned that, okay, well, I cannot hand the money over, but then am I capable of controlling the behavior or the expenditure that created the debt in the first place and then might create future debts in future? And I think if that were the case, if you had that kind of democratic control, then maybe fine.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then I think that it's correct to be wary of that. And frankly, if I were the Italians or the Greeks, I would be extremely wary of the German finance ministry coming in and saying, okay, guys, we're in control now because we're funding this.
Yeah.
I think if you still believe, to the extent that we're still in a Europe of nation states, which are kind of hybrid with some European democratic structures, but with some of the most important spending powers.
But this tension is, however, there in the discussion, of course, that the southern countries feel the Dutch finance minister is coming in and giving his orders. Mrs. Melandri, to have the same question to you, do you feel the northern countries not wanting a real transfer union? Do you, as Italian, do you consider that as a lack of solidarity?
No, and I'm not sure with the basic assumption, because Mr. Rutte, when was that? In July, when the recovery funds talk, he arrived in a very belligerent way. But I must say, Mr. Rutte is the kind of his party. If I were Dutch, I would never vote for him. But I must say that I admired the realism of the fact that nevertheless he did come to an agreement after even not such long talks. It was even much shorter than I would have imagined. What do I mean? I mean that the need for a European Union, and the word here is union, I think is very deeply felt by everyone. And it is evidently felt as something which is in everyone's interest. Otherwise, this kind of accord of agreement would simply not take place. So relatively painlessly. Yeah. There was a very striking thing that happened. It really surprised me, and I think I'm not the only one.
Good. One more last issue, because migration, of course, it always still is a very important topic. Moria was on fire. The EU seems impotent. What can or should the EU do with respect to the Greek crisis, Mr. Rachman?
Well, it's a very difficult one. I think Francesca probably, because she will have a clearer answer than me, because I think she...
Okay, we could start with Ms. Melandri first.
I think that it was really interesting. I was in Berlin last week, and the Germans in a kind of paradoxical situation, so that Merkel will say we were absolutely right to do what we did in 2015, and I think most, majority opinion agrees with that. But then they say, but we can never do that again.
They did. They just took in 1,000 and I don't know how many.
Yeah, they did. They took, but a few thousand. They're not going to take another million. And so I think that there's an immediate humanitarian crisis to do with what happened on Lesbos, and those are manageable amounts of people who can be distributed around Europe and should be if you can do it. But I think that the fear is that there are something like 4 million refugees in Turkey alone. The war is still raging in Syria. And, I think that tacitly the whole of Europe has moved towards a sort of Orbanism, which is saying, you know what, we're not going to allow that many refugees in.
Orbanism, that is a new word, yeah.
It goes back to this difficult politics that I was talking about earlier. So I think it's a management issue with occasional, sometimes the situation will be so unbearable that you'll have to intervene, but I don't see a clean way of dealing with it.
No. Mrs. Melandri?
Definitely not a clean way. It's very interesting. I would say that Gideon is the describer of how things are, which is his job. I would like to propose not solutions now, but directions towards which we have to become used to think about. That's the first way. That's the first thing you have to do to imagine new things. You have to imagine that some other way is possible.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll leave it at this right now because we've got an audience here and we've got a large audience online, and I'm definitely sure that they have some questions to ask you. Anne-Marijn, she's my assistant here now, although she's the boss. But is there anybody who has a question here in the room? She has a huge microphone. No, and Anne-Marie, do you have an idea of the questions we have online on the Slido?
Yeah, I have a question, but I also see a question here in the room.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your expose. Interesting, very interesting, and very topical, of course, because things keep moving sort of day by day by now on Europe, and I was wondering what Mr. Rachman's take would be on. I heard Timothy Garton-Ash say 3 days ago that, and actually Caroline de Gruyter, who is sort of one of the best commentators in Holland, predict that the British government would try to wreck Europe, you know, because they leave in the Union, and what they would do in the next sort of years would try to drive Europe apart. I was rather struck by that, but both of them were sort of saying...
Do I think that's the case?
So I was wondering what your take
I don't think that's his view.
on that would be.
Mr. Rachman?
If Tim Garton-Ash said that, I'm a bit surprised, but maybe he did. I mean, I think there's no doubt that there is a radical faction, which is represented in this government, which has always seen the European Union as a kind of almost an oppressive project that needed to be taken apart because they're very, very attached to the nation state. And maybe Michael Gove at times, who's a prominent figure in the government, has been there. Certainly Nigel Farage and so on. They would unapologetically say that. But I don't think that their majority opinion, even within this government. I mean, I think Boris Johnson is not a very clear thinker, but I don't think that he is opposed to the European project. Actually, I mean, weirdly, I remember the first time I met him was at somebody's wedding in the early 2000s, and he was already a Eurosceptic thinker. And I remember saying to him, you know, a lot of people in Brussels thought that your Euroscepticism was a bit of an act and that you're actually secretly in favor of the European project. And he said, it's not a secret. I mean, of course I'm in favor. How could you be against? Which is kind of an ironic statement in retrospect, but I don't think it was utterly insincere. I think his position is that this is not for us, but if the European Union wants to kind of go ahead and become more integrated. Indeed, that was one of the reasons that his kind of faction in Britain decided to leave, was I think that they felt that Europe was heading towards a federal future, which the UK, for its own reasons, would not be part of. So although I think that view of the UK, that view does exist in Britain, let's try and take the EU apart. A, I think it's unrealistic. And B, I don't think it's majority opinion even in the Conservative Party. I think that there are negotiations which become extremely bad-tempered and could go quite badly wrong. But I think the long-term vision for the people, you know, who I talk to in Downing Street who are trying to work on a British strategy for foreign policy is not of destroying the European Union. On the contrary, it's to try to create a cooperative strategic relationship with the EU in the long run, even if we've got a few difficult years ahead of us.
Okay, well, let's hope for that. Do we have another question here in the room? Well, Anne-Marie, then it's time to look at your Slido questions.
Yeah, it was actually the question from Nathan was to both of you, and he was asking, what do you think of the fact that issues such as race and ethnicity are actually not really being discussed on an EU level? And for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, which we saw in the past months. What is your opinion on this?
Francesca Melandri?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you for raising it. Well, this is becoming, again, since immigration is not so much as it's been talked about something, should we have it or should we not have it? It's something that is there. The new Europeans are there. These are our co-citizens, and they are a lot. It's very, the effects of the Black Lives Matter upheaval in the States, in Europe, I do hope it brings a reflection, a long-term reflection. without parroting the American situation, because it's not our situation. It's a very different story. We don't have the legacy of slavery. We have a very different story. But it is becoming very important to address the fact that basically we always talk about, here we are, this is exactly what we're doing. We are all white people and we are talking about the new Europeans, and they are always talked about. They're always the object of the discourse, and this is no longer sustainable because they are our citizens, and they are not only refugees and so on, but they're also maybe journalists. They're also teachers. They're also doctors, and they're part of society in every way. This is one of the things that, this cognitive apocalypse trope that I mentioned. This is something that really has to be included. This talking about migration always as it being an object, this has to change. This has to change.
Okay,
we have to hear new voices about this.
And that is our cognitive apocalypse, as you rightly said. Another question, Anne-Marijn?
I'm just looking into the audience here. Maybe there is one final question, and otherwise we can maybe wrap up. If nobody...
Mostly for Francesca, you were talking about how we need to, even if you can't open the borders tomorrow, you're suggesting that we move in a direction of a different mentality as a more sustainable option. And I'm wondering what that looks like to you, like on a practical level. What do we need to do that?
Well, we need to discuss, we need to start talking, because again, imagining and talking is the first step to, making new things like the European Union, which was imagined in Ventotene. We have to start thinking about the right to mobility, both in a European viewpoint, both in a world viewpoint, and we have to stop seeing it as only us richer countries allowing other people in or not, but rather as an exchange which can be fruitful for both partners. It can be an exchange of, if you only see the people who arrive as poor, desperate people which we need to help, this is of course a narrative which always only put them in a needy position. But we need to start talking, and we will have to do a lot of this talking because it's really only just beginning, about the exchange this brings for the good of both, interlocutors.
Okay, Mr. Rachman, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that in a sense, maybe Britain is in a slightly different place. I mean, I think Francesca's right. It is quite striking that this is an all-white group, and that would probably be quite difficult to get away with in the UK now. There's much more of a concentration on diversity and on recognizing the fact that we're a multi-ethnic society. But I think that, maybe that's because our immigrant populations have been in Britain for now decades, and also the impact of what's happening in the US and so on has kind of forced the conversation along. But I think that each country in Europe, there is a kind of pan-European debate, but each country is in a slightly different position, but also affecting the way in which they talk about it. I mean, one way of thinking about this may seem superficial, but is in the football where, now if black players get booed or barracked, as they used to be quite routinely, and sometimes still are, there are actually protocols in place on European football, and the English team, almost left the pitch, I think, in a game in Eastern Europe, not because we're so virtuous, but because there were now ways of coping with this. So the debate is moving on. What kind of acts of racism that would have been routine 10 years ago are no longer tolerated, and I think the situation will be different again in 10 years' time. But it's also a complex picture. I mean, so that Francesca was saying, that we should think of this as an exchange and so on, but people's views aren't always predictable. Like my members of my family work with a lot of immigrants in a hospital. A lot of them voted for Brexit actually because they wanted to control immigration. That people aren't totally, in one box that if you're an immigrant, you'll necessarily be in favor of more immigration. So it's part of the kind of mess of democracy. But I think that the broadly, maybe something we can agree on is that our societies are becoming more multicultural, are becoming, and have been for some time, but becoming more aware of it and more aware that they need to change.
So in that respect.
And also we start from the assumption that if only we would let them, they would all want to come here, which is not the case, because most people, when they do emigrate, the mobility of humankind on the planet is actually very low. They tend to actually move only towards closer places. For instance, we never talk about the immigration and the emigration within Africa itself, which is much bigger than that from Africa to Europe. It's incredibly, I don't have the numbers now, but it's on an absolutely different scale. So I think there are many, to answer to give another part of the answer to the question about what should we do, again, we should really reconsider our assumptions, and the assumption that if only they could, everybody would come to us is probably an assumption which needs to be
a false assumption. Yeah, okay. Thank you. We've got a final question for you in the audience.
Well, since we're drifting off again in this whole discourse of how multicultural and how open our society is, I wonder, this would be a discourse, a narrative which would fit indeed Italians. I mean, the way the Italians treated some place in Africa is really horrible, or Dutchmen, the way we treated some places in Asia. But, I mean, the Italians were very harsh towards the Albanians. How do the experience in Europe of a majority of the Europeans who suffered under the colonial empire of the Soviets fit into this? This is a truly Western European and Southern European discourse. Please remember that if we talk about Europe, there's a majority of European peoples who've lived, since 1945 under a totalitarian regime which they didn't choose. And as you rightly said, you started with Baba Yar. And there were several Italians and Dutchmen and Belgians and who, envisaged already during the war a nationalistic Europe. But this discourse is this narrative is only true for the few countries in Europe which had colonies, and the majority of European countries was under Ottoman or Soviet occupation or German occupation for the most period of the 20th century. So this is sort of an exclusive narrative which excludes the Central and Eastern European experiences, I would say. It's rather problematic in that respect.
Well, historian Timothy is neither. Now, his discourse is very complex, and I'm not here to repeat it. But he does frame the relationship. For instance, the invasion of Germany of Eastern Europe. He does frame it in colonial terms. In a way, you could also see the history of Eastern Europe as a byproduct of the longer European colonial history. Very briefly, he describes the invasion of the Slav countries by Germany as the German Nazi way of being colonial, of arriving in a place which, exactly like the Americans, for instance, the local population doesn't count anything, and what they're really there to do is to plunder the resources, or have the aim to plunder the resources if they had won the war. So the colonial mind frame and mindset is very complex. In Italy, we have still another story. You could say that we belong to the colonial history, to the world colonial history, from at least two different sides. We were colonists, for instance, in Libya and Somalia and Eritrea, and we were occupiers in Ethiopia. But the creation of the Italian national state itself, some argue that it was an act of colonization of the north, from the north to the south, of the south by the north. So it's relationships, it's hierarchies of power, and these are very complicated, and there is not a one-size-all one-size-fits-all lens through which you can see the history of the whole of Europe.
No, so we can conclude that this is not a unification thing, that we share a history of being colonizers. So that is not in that the Europeans are not one. Thank you very much. We've got to leave it at this. Thank you very much for your interesting and inspiring thoughts. Thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you for all your questions. That is also concluding this program. Please do look at the YouTube channel on the Forum on European Culture for all the other programs we're going to have this week. There'll be a lot of theatre, discussions and debates in the coming days. And finally, of course, many thanks to our guests of tonight, to Francesca, Melandri and Gideon Rachman, for this inspiring conversation about our future, about our European future. Stay healthy. See you again next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.